Shortly before my father died, he said to me, "You know, you never wrote a story with a villain in it." I told him that was one of the things I learned in college after the war. While I was studying to be an anthropologist, I was always working as a policeman reporter for the famous Chicago City News Bureau for $28 a week. One time they switched me from the night shift to the day shift, so I worked 16 hours straight. We were supported by all newspapers in the town, and the AP and the UP and all that. And we would cover the courts of the police stations and the fire department and the Coast Guard out on Lake Michigan and all that. We were connected to the institutions and supported by the means of pneumatic tubes which ran under the street of Chicago. Reporters would telephone in the stories to writers wearing headphones, and the writers would stencil the stories on mimeograph sheets. The stories were mimeographed and stuffed into brass and velvet cartridges, which the pneumatic tubes ate. The very toughest reporter and writers were women who had taken over the jobs of men who'd gone to war. In the first story I covered, I had to dictate over the telephone to one of those beastly girls. It was about a young veteran who had taken a job running an old-fashioned elevator in the office building. The elevator door on the first floor was ornamental iron lace. Iron ivy snaked in and out of the holes. There was an iron twig with iron lovebirds perched upon it. This veteran decided to take his car into the basement, and he closed the door and started down, but his wedding ring was caught in the ornaments. So he was hoisted into the air, and the floor of the car that went down dropped from under him, and the top of his car squashed him. So it goes. So I phoned this in, and the woman who was going to cut the stencil asked me, "What did his wife say?" "She doesn't know yet," I said. "It just happened."
"Call her up and get a statement."
"What?"
"Tell her you're old Captain Finn of the police department. So you have some sad news. Give her the news and see what she says."
So I did. She said about what you would expect her to say. There was a baby, and so on. When I got back to the office, the woman writer asked me, just for her own information, what the squash guy had looked like when he was squashed. I told her.
"Did it bother you?"
she said. She was eating a Three Musketeers candy bar. "Heck no, Nancy," I said. "I've seen lots worse than that in the war." Even then I was supposedly writing a book about Dresden. It wasn't a famous air raid back then in America. Not many Americans knew how much worse it had been than the Hiroshima, for instance. I didn't know that either. There hadn't been much publicity. I happened to tell a University of Chicago professor at a cocktail party about the raid I had seen it in the book I would write. He was a member of a thing called the Committee on Social Thought, and he told me about the concentration camps and about how the Germans had made soap and candles out of the fat of dead Jews and so on. All I could say was, I know. World War II was certainly made everybody very tough, and I had become a public relations man for General Electric in Schenectady, New York, and a volunteer fireman in the village of Alpos, where I brought my first home. My boss there was one of the toughest guys I had ever hoped to meet. He had been a lieutenant colonel in public relations in Baltimore. While I was in Schenectady, he joined the Dutch Reformed Church, which is a very tough church indeed. He used to ask me sneeringly sometimes why I hadn't been an officer, as though I'd done something wrong. My wife and I had lost our baby fat. Those were our scrawny years. We had lots of scrawny veterans and their scrawny wives for friends. The nicest veterans in Schenectady, I thought. The kindest and funniest ones, the ones who hated war the most, were the ones who'd really fought. I wrote the Air Force back then, asking for details about the raid on Dresden, who ordered it, how many planes did it, why they did it, what desirable results there had been, and so on. I was answered by a man, like myself, was in public relations. He said that he was sorry, but that information was still top secret. I read the letter out loud to my wife, and I said, "Secret? My God, from whom?" We were United World Federalists back then. I don't know what we are now. Telephoners, I guess? We telephone a lot. Or I do anyway. Late at night. A couple of weeks after I telephoned my old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare, I really did go over to see him. That must have been in 1964 or so, or the last year was before New York's World Fair. Où est fugace le bon terre année? My name is Jan Jansen. There was a young man from Stamboul. I took the two little girls with me, my daughter, her nanny, and her best friends, Alice and Michelle. They had never been off Cape Cod before. When we saw a river, we had to stop so we could stand by it and think for a while. They had never seen water in that long and narrow, unsalted form before. The river was the Hudson. There were the carp, and we saw them. There were big atomic submarines. We saw waterfalls, too, jumping off cliffs into the valley of the Delaware. There were lots of things to stop and see. And then it was time to go. Always time to go. The little girls were wearing white party dresses and black party shoes, so strangers would know at once how nice they were. Time to go, girls, I'd say, and we would go. The sun went down, and we had supper in the Italian place, and then I knocked on the front door of the beautiful stone house of Bernard V. O'Hare. I was carrying a bottle of Irish whiskey like a dinner bell. I met his nice wife, Mary, to whom I dedicate this book. I dedicate it to Gerard Mueller, the Dresden taxi driver, too. Marie O'Hare is a trained nurse, which is a lovely thing for a woman to be. Mary admired the two little girls I'd brought, mixed them in with her own children, sent them all upstairs to play games and watch television. It was only after the children were gone that I sensed that Mary didn't like me, or didn't like something about that night. She was polite but chilly. "It's a nice cozy house you have here," I said. And it really was. "Oh, I fixed up the place. You can talk and not be bothered," she said. "Good," I said. And I imagined two leather chairs near a fire in a paneled room where two old soldiers could drink and talk. But she took us into the kitchen. She had put two straight black chairs at a kitchen table with a white porcelain top. That table was screaming with reflected light from a 200-watt bulb overhead. Mary had prepared an operating room. She put only one glass on it, which was for me. She explained that O'Hare couldn't drink the hard stuff since the war. So we sat down. O'Hare was embarrassed, but he wouldn't tell me what was wrong. I couldn't imagine what it was about me that could burn up Mary so. I was a family man. I'd been married only once. I wasn't drunk. I hadn't done her husband any dirt in the war. She fixed herself a Coca-Cola, made a lot of noise banging the ice cube tray in the stainless steel sink. Then she went to another part of the house, but she wouldn't sit still. She was moving all over the house, opening and shutting doors, even moving furniture around to work off anger. I asked O'Hare what I'd said or done to make her act that way. It's all right," he said. "Don't worry about it. It doesn't have anything to do with you." That was kind of him. He was lying. It had everything to do with me. So we tried to ignore Mary and remember the war. I took a couple of belts of booze I brought. We would chuckle or grin sometimes, as though war stories were coming back, but neither of us could remember anything good. O'Hare remembered one guy who got into a lot of wine in Dresden before it was bombed, and we had to take him home in a wheelbarrow. It wasn't much to write a book about. I remember two Russian soldiers who had looted a clock factory that had a horse-drawn wagon full of clocks. They were happy and drunk, they were smoking huge cigarettes, and had rolled in a newspaper. That was about it for memories. And Mary was still making noise. She finally came out into the kitchen again for a Coke. She took another tray of ice cubes from the refrigerator, banged it in the sink, even though where plenty of ice was out. Then she turned to me. Let me see how angry she was. And that anger was for me. She had been talking to herself, so what she said was a fragment of a much larger conversation. "You were just babies then," she said. "What?" I said. "You were just babies in the war, like the ones upstairs." I nodded. This was all true. We had been foolish virgins in the war, right at the end of childhood. "But you're not going to write it that way, are you?" That wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I